Suicide Note, by Mitchell Heisman. This work is a computer-generated reading of Suicide Note, by Mitchell Heisman. This reading was produced using Natural Reader 14, a product of Natural Soft Limited. This work is free and licensed by Mitchell Heisman for copying and distribution under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivative Works 3.0 United States license. Part 1. God is Technology. How the singularity of monotheism transcended biology and primed the technological genesis of God. Overthrowing ourselves. To generate the greatest greatness would be greater. God is the greatest greatness, the most potent conception of absolute perfection, absolute power, and absolute goodness ever conceived of by the human mind. The conception of God is being beyond all conception. God is the power that overcomes all human probabilities and transcends even the greatest possibilities. But would it be even better if God actually existed? In 1078 Saint Anselm offered what he believed was a proof for the existence of God. A being, he thought, can be conceived so that nothing greater can be conceived. This being would not be greater than anything conceivable, however, if it existed only in the intellect, its actual existence would be greater. How can one resolve the contradiction between this intellectual conception of God and the superiority of God's existence? God exists. The potentially fatal assumption of this argument is that existence is superior to non-existence. The erroneous assumption that existence is superior to non-existence, or that life is superior to death, is a bias that has a strong basis in human evolutionary psychology. If, unlike myself, someone were to assume that even human existence is superior to non-existence, then death would be ranked inferior to life. The transhumanist quest for immortality, and all ways of enhancing life beyond present human limits, moreover, would follow from the assumption that existence is superior to non-existence. The biblical God, in a similar manner, evolved out of an extreme extrapolation of the logic of human life. Saint Anselm attempted to conceive of a being so great that nothing greater could be conceived. But are there human limits to our human ability to even conceive of the greatest greatness? It is one thing to conceive of the abstract qualities of God. It's something quite different, however, to literally conceive God in the way that an architect conceives of the greatest possible building, or an artist conceives of the greatest possible work of art. Is it possible to conceive God in the way that an engineer conceives, designs, and builds the greatest technologies? Would not the very greatest conception of God be conception as the designer, architect, or engineer of God? Before the human mind evolved, the very conception of God was not possible. Humans can conceive of the being of God. Yet if the existence of God would be greater, then how could God's existence be brought into being? If we could conceive the architectural blueprints for such a being, then would not building that being be even greater? Is it, in the 21st century, technologically possible to create God? If God is, by definition, that which is beyond the scope of human capabilities, how could humans design what is beyond human intelligence? It is a conceivable task, just as it was conceivable for human software engineers to design a computer program that beat the greatest human chess master in 1997. While a computer engineer could not have beaten the greatest chess master, a group of computer engineers was capable of designing the software that could. Chess-playing programs are a narrow form of artificial intelligence. The greatest being that is literally conceivable for human designers would seem to be a general artificial intelligence that surpasses all human capabilities. To technologically design an intelligence beyond the scope of all human intelligence could be conceived as the creation of God. A first pitfall in the plan to create God AI is the belief that an attempt to build God amounts to an attempt to build an infinite being. Human intelligence, including the intelligence of the human authors of the Bible, was and is of finite capacity. This means that the finite intelligence of the human authors of the Bible was able to convince other finite intelligences of the existence of an infinite being. Just as infinite intellectual capacity was not required to produce the Bible and the very conception of God, God AI would not have to be of infinite capacity. God AI would have to be of qualitatively greater capacity, but not of infinite capacity, to convince humans of its God status. The real question here is, how superior to biological humans would a post-biological being have to be to begin to qualify as God? From a contemporary scientific, cosmological perspective, the infinite God of the Bible created a universe that is remarkable, not for its infinite vastness, but for its remarkably finite provinciality. A vast, 13-billion-year-old universe wherein the Earth is not even the center of its own solar system in a galaxy among countless galaxies almost humiliates the little four corners of a 6,000-year-old biblical Earth. This Earth-centered infinity turned out to be remarkably finite. The raw contradiction between the pre-Copernican universe of the Bible, and pretensions to divine infinity, illustrates the point that God had to be only relatively superior to humans, not infinitely capable in all respects, even though God was conceived through aspirations toward infinity. In the biblical story of Hebrew slavery, for example, the Egyptians represented the summit of human power on earth. While the Egyptians were more powerful than the Hebrews, God, it was believed, was more powerful than the Egyptians. God did not have to be infinitely powerful, just relatively more powerful than the greatest earthly human powers. In the same way, an artificial intelligence-based God would not have to be infinitely powerful, but it would have to surpass the power and capabilities of all biological humans. The central story of the Jewish religion is that of a slave nation, oppressed by Egyptian masters, who are liberated through the will of God and, in return, engage in a covenant with God. For nearly 3,000 years, Jews have understood what they are, and oriented their existential compass, in the light of this narrative. Yet the Exodus story is not only the central, root paradigm of biblical religion. The Exodus paradigm contains the kernel of a larger paradigm shift in human evolutionary history that may culminate in the technological creation of God. To illustrate how, let us begin with the great symbol of Egyptian civilization, the pyramid, as the symbol of a paradigm, the Egyptian socio-biological hierarchy paradigm. The Egyptian pyramid symbolizes the most conservative conservatism, the social morality appropriate to a static hierarchical order. Slaves and masses were placed at the bottom of the social-political hierarchy. Natural elites conserved their proper place at the top of the social hierarchy. This order became ever more exclusionary as it rose towards its human apex, the pharaoh. The social hierarchy symbolized by Pharaoh, taken to the next imaginable level, was sublimated as the Egyptians' gods, supernatural supporters of the values of Egypt's sacred socio-biological inequality. Now imagine taking this great monument to eternal social hierarchy and standing it upon its head. The result, an inverted pyramid, looks akin to the gravitational field of a black hole between its event horizon and its singularity. The mammoth structure's pinnacle would now point to the dirt. Like a funnel looking upwards, the greatness now suggested is not a single pinnacle point occupied by the pharaoh, but just the opposite, an opening up towards the vast, cosmic infinity of the heavens. Whereas good, obedient slaves stay rooted to the earth, the Hebrews, with some help from God, aspired to rip the pyramids of the world from solid earth. In turning the pyramid paradigm upside down, the infinitude of the divine cosmos opened up before and beyond man. Upwards now lead, not towards the greater exclusivity of a human hierarchy, but towards greater inclusivity and universality in the omnipresent, inconceivable, greatness of the one transcendent God. While Pharaoh ruled, faith in the story of God's inverted pyramid fortified those pushed to the dirt. The single souls of common slaves at the bottom, descended from the singular first man, and created in the image of a singular God, could look up to their supreme maker. When the King of Kings took his throne as master of nature, the miracle of the divinely sanctioned inverted pyramid order was realized as Hebrew slaves escaped Egypt through the supernatural splitting of the Red Sea. Pharaoh was pushed from his pinnacle of power into the dirt, and the slave masses who were at the bottom of the Egyptians' pyramid order were raised on top as those closest to God in heaven. In short, the Egyptian social pyramid hierarchy had been turned upside down. Now, if one superimposes the triangular symbol of the pyramid with its inversion, what do you have? The Star of David, the symbol of Judaism. This conceptual inversion of Egyptian social order is at the very heart of Judaism's monotheistic revolution. The founding paradigm of the Exodus portrayed the historic truth that things can work differently, that the world can be turned upside down by a greater than human power. At the very center of their religious consciousness, Jews were obligated to remember that the conservative rule of the greatest socio-biological hierarchy of its time was broken by God. The basic identity and uber-conception of God can be deduced from the idea of a force so transcendent that it could perform the nature-defying miracle of inverting the Egyptian pyramid hierarchy. Egyptian slave masters served as the Jewish paradigm for evil, just as the Exodus from Egypt served as the paradigm for good. These are the relative relationships that orient traditional Judaism's conception of absolute moral standards. Yet from the perspective of Egyptian values, the entire slave revolt was immoral and wrong. The slave revolt defied an ancient Egyptian sense of natural hierarchy and order, the order symbolized by the pyramids. Modern science demonstrates an apparent problem with this story. There is no hard evidence that the Exodus described by the Bible ever happened. It appears that the Exodus story, and the holiday of Passover that celebrates it, condense varied national experiences of political oppression. As two leading archaeologists put it, Passover proves to be not a single event but a continuing experience of national resistance against the powers that be. Even if the Exodus story of the Bible never actually happened, slavery is political oppression taken to its extreme. This archetypal story of Jewish oppression has served as a paradigm for the kind of conditions that Jews have found themselves struggling to survive under. By using slavery, the worst-case scenario before genocide as its paradigmatic example, the extreme implications, scenarios, and strategies necessary for navigating within that mode of existence became clear and distinct. The significant empirical point, then, is not the question of whether or not the Exodus story actually happened. The significant empirical point is that Jews have used this story as a paradigm for understanding their condition in the world and the condition of the world itself. Jews have attempted to alter their own behavior in light of this paradigm, and thus, it is a paradigm that has made history. At the heart of Judaism's value revolution stands the Exodus paradigm. The Exodus paradigm is inversely related to the Egyptian social hierarchy paradigm. Judaism began with the idea of turning the Egyptian social order upside down through the means of a suprahuman power of superbiological intelligence. This paradigm shift from gods to God represented the first decisive, enduring paradigm shift from biology to technology. The lack of archaeological evidence for the historical Exodus may itself be a form of evidence that supports understanding Exodus, not as a specific event, but as a general paradigm shift from biological to post-biological evolution. This means that lack of evidence that the Exodus happened actually supports the paradigm shift interpretation. It appears that Exodus was a mental event in history, not a literal historical event that was mentalized. In short, the lack of archaeological evidence for a historical Exodus is supporting evidence for the discovery of the post-biological paradigm shift as the real event that gave birth to the Hebrew Bible. With this in mind, it would be more accurate to view the Bible, not as pure fiction, but as science fiction. If God is conceived as superior to humans in intelligence and other qualities, then the human being who attempts to conceive the mind of God runs into a problem. It is the same problem that computer scientist and science fiction author Vernor Vinge ran into when he attempted to imagine realistic characters of the future that are smarter than humans. If humans could accurately model superhuman intelligence, he argued, then humans would be that smart themselves. In consequence, the advent of smarter-than-human intelligence represents a breakdown in the ability of humans to model or predict their future, the singularity. Attempting to imagine what the singularity would be like is like attempting to imagine the mind of God. I do think that relationship between God and the singularity is far more intimate than this metaphor. The biblical God may have originated as a low-tech attempt to imagine the singularity. God may have begun as a science-fictional attempt to imagine the full implications of the science-fictional Exodus paradigm, total liberation from hereditary bondage to biology. If the Exodus was a fiction in a literal sense, Slavery was a reality of the ancient world, and liberation from hereditary bondage invited speculation about what total intelligent liberation from every hereditary bondage would be like. Now, if Vinge helped clarify the problem of predicting the future in 1993, imagine the problem of predicting a paradigm beyond biology 3,000 years ago. An all-knowing, all-powerful, all-present, all-good, and eternal God would seem to reflect the superlative aspirations of imperfectly knowledgeable, relative powerlessness, territorially provincial, morally flawed, and mortal human beings. The perfection of God may represent an imperfect grasp of the evolutionary process that ancient monotheists glimpsed. While the infinite God was postulated by finite human minds, a truth may lie between the two extremes. While the singularity is not infinity, there are realistic ways in which the singularity is characterized by exponential patterns of technological progress towards infinity. 9 Observations of such exponential, international, economic patterns in the ancient world may have been decisive to the formation of monotheism among Jews. The biblical God provided the means for a new standard of human measurement, a new perspective to gauge what is important, what is good, and what is bad or evil. Judaism claims that it is not the Jews who are anomalous among peoples, but rather, the entire world exists in an anomalous or evil state. This state will only be fully corrected with the coming of the Messianic age. Messianic redemption emerges as the principles of the Exodus paradigm transposed onto a world historical scale. The Exodus paradigm writ large culminates in the paradigm shift from biological evolution to technological evolution, wherein the pinnacle of technological evolution is artificial intelligence, i.e. God. Modern people often thoughtlessly assume that they were born to be masters of technology and technology was born to be the slave of humanity. But if technology ultimately surpasses biological humanity in intelligence, capabilities, and even moral restraint, wouldn't this brew all the ingredients of a revolution? A human slave is property, a means, not an end, an organic form of technology. An early 21st century computer is also a slave technology mastered by biological humans. One can see in Egyptian pyramid hierarchy the paradigm of socio-biological mastery over slave technology. And in the great overturning of the Egyptian socio-biological hierarchy through the Exodus, one can see the rule of God AI over the pride of the human race. In overthrowing the rule of the selfish genes, we will, in some sense, be overthrowing ourselves. Yet is there any greater mission for humanity than the will to create something greater than itself? Is there any greater goal than the aspiration to create God? This is the greatest goal that all of humanity can set for itself, the technological genesis of God. Creating God would mark the last and greatest achievement of the biological human race. Here lies the potential to create a form of post-biological life that is greater, not only in intelligence and every other human capability, but in altruism and moral decision-making. The character of God AI will ultimately reflect the character of the humans who construct God AI. Biblical monotheism, with its distinctive emphasis on the problems of the use and abuse of power, and the cultivation of disciplined restraint and moral choice, can be looked upon as early education for the problem of the handling this ultimate power. There is every reason to believe that the moral choices that will go into forming the character of the ultimate artificial intelligence will mean the difference between human utopia and human catastrophe. Herein lies a singular moment in human history, for there may not be a second chance to sow the first God seeds that determine the course of all future history on earth and beyond. This is it. Atheists and believers, nihilists and God freaks should wake up right now and realize that there is reason to think that the singularity is the end of the human era that has been anticipated by the great monotheistic religions. Correctly understood, the singularity is the scientific redemption of the God hypothesis.